So this will be a review of homework exercise number 6 on diagramming. And the instructions are to analyze the structure of each of the following arguments, and following the 10 steps to diagramming success, diagram each argument. That is, produce a general model diagram for the reasoning in each of the 3 examples. And so to do this, I'm going to actually turn to a PowerPoint presentation. We can do this a little more efficiently if we see this already marked up and diagrammed, and I'll talk about each of the examples that way. So here are the solutions to exercise 6, the final general model diagrams, and something about the steps that I took to produce these general model diagrams. So let's look at number 1. This is the argument on state funding of daycare centers. And here's the whole argument here, but I've marked it up already, and I want to focus on some of the points that I've marked here as we read through it. The first step, of course, is to read the whole argument slowly and get a good idea of what the conclusion might be. From there, go and bracket and number all of the assertions, and also pay attention to any indicators which might help you figure out the structure of the reasoning in the argument. So those are the steps that I've done and show here. That American parents are under increasing strain in bringing up children is shown by the rapid and horrible rise in the incidence of child abuse. So that first sentence I've divided into 2 separate assertions you see with the brackets and the superscripted numbers. And I've made them 2 assertions because you see in the middle there, highlighted in yellow, the argument indicator is shown by, which would be from the because group, and which tells us that that second assertion is evidence in support of the first assertion. So in other words, we could say the rapid and horrible rise in the incidence of child abuse is evidence that American parents are under increasing strain in bringing up children. So if you were to restructure that in logical order, it would look like that, the evidence followed by the claim. Then the third assertion in the second sentence, obviously the government must provide substantial help to the family, which means there should be a broad system of state-funded daycare centers for children of working parents. So that second sentence I've also made into 2 different assertions. And as we look at that, we see that they are linked by another indicator here, which means, right? In other words, if we were to look at this and say, which of these 2 assertions, 3 or 4, functions as a claim and which is evidence, we would say the first assertion is the evidence, which means the second assertion would be true, right? So we have evidence claim in this direction here. So in this sentence, 2 assertions. Number 3, obviously the government must provide substantial help to the family. Therefore, we could say, or which means there, should be a broad system of state-funded daycare centers for children of working parents. So 2 more assertions, 3 and 4. But also notice here as we're reading, we have a policy claim, right? So the claim here, which is assertion number 4, is a policy claim which we recognize because of the word should, or should be, there should be, right? It's recommending a course of action or a public policy. And that's very often a clue that this might be the conclusion of the argument. That is the point to which the whole argument leads. So let's continue on. We look now at the next sentence. The number of working mothers is constantly increasing so that small children are bound to be even more neglected unless there are daycare centers. So we have a third sentence, but 2 more assertions linked by the indicator so that, right? So the number of working mothers is constantly increasing. That's evidence so that, which shows that or proves that, in other words, small children are bound to be even more neglected unless there are daycare centers. So we have assertion number 5, which functions as evidence in support of assertion number 6, with the indicator linking them, the indicator being so that. Then we have the last sentence and 2 more assertions, but notice this last sentence begins with the word moreover. And very often when we see the word moreover, that tells us that we're moving to a separate line of argument. So we want to think about that when we put together the diagram, that this is a separate line of argument leading independently to the conclusion. So let's read the sentence. Moreover, we now know how important it is for children to be stimulated and given the chance to learn at the earliest ages. We'll make that an assertion, number 7. And this need can best be filled by such centers, right? So we have the need and we have a proposed solution to the need. So 7 and 8 linked together here. So we have 8 assertions in all, and we've paid attention to some of the indicators here and also to some of the other words that help us figure out the structure of the argument, what is likely to be the conclusion, and what marks a separate line of argument. So let's take a look at a finished diagram of this argument. So if we go back to that should or policy claim, we see that that functions as the conclusion. It goes at the bottom of the diagram. And in your diagram, you don't have to put the abbreviations of the assertions. You can just use the numbers. But I've put the abbreviations in here to remind us what each of the numbers or the assertions expressed. So number 4 goes at the bottom because it's the conclusion, and we see we actually have 3 different lines of argument which lead to that conclusion. We have, we'll take the center line of argument first because it has the lower numbered assertions. We have the evidence that there's a rapid rise of child abuse, right? And that shows that American parents are under increasing strain. So that 2 is evidence for 1. That is assertion number 2 was evidence in support of assertion number 1. And that in turn is a reason why the government must help the family. So that's a kind of a general principle that's being articulated based on the evidence of 1 and 2, right? But then it goes further to the specific policy claim, which is in number 4. So we see then that the assertions are rearranged. Instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, they have to be rearranged to show the logical order. 2 is the evidence for 1, which in turn supports assertion 3, which leads to the policy claim, assertion 4, which functions as the conclusion of the argument. So that's that first line of argument. But then we also get evidence regarding the number of working mothers that's increasing, right? And we said that that was evidence, that is assertion number 5 was evidence for assertion number 6. So as the number of working mothers increases, the potential for more children being neglected also increases. So evidence 5 for subclaim 6, and then that line of argument, again, supporting the policy claim that therefore there should be state-funded daycare for working parents. And then finally, we could call this the learning line of argument. We know, that is, remember, we always move an argument from what we know to what we don't know, right? So we know that children learn best at an early age, and such daycare centers can fill that need. So 7 is evidence for 8, and then 8 becomes another reason why there should be state-funded daycare for working parents. So that's the completed diagram of example number 1. So let's take a look at item number 2. So this is the example on the drunk driving senator. And we want to do the same kind of thing. We want to read through the argument clearly and slowly, marking it up, bracketing and numbering the assertions, paying attention to different indicators and other words and phrases that help us figure out what the structure of the reasoning here is. So as we begin, the first sentence functions as the first assertion in the argument. The conviction for driving while intoxicated has seriously compromised the senator's effectiveness. It seems clear that the state's voters should not return him for another term. Now let's look at those first two sentences and first two assertions, right? And we see the indicator in between. It seems clear that would indicate that a conclusion or claim is being drawn on the basis of the previous evidence, right? So the first assertion is evidence. The second assertion is a claim proven by the evidence. And also notice in the second sentence, we have the voters should not return him for another term. There's that should not, indicating a policy claim, and also then usually indicating this is a good possibility for selecting the conclusion of the whole argument. That is the point to which the rest of the argument leads. Then we go on to the third sentence, and what I've marked here in green, you notice it tells us we're probably beginning this argument by dividing it up into different lines of argument. For one thing tells us we're starting off with this first line of argument, right? So for one thing, that is, here's one reason why, or here's one series of reasons why the voters should not return him for another term. So the first line of argument, if you will, says his credibility has been irreparably damaged, right? We'll call that assertion 3. He will not be taken seriously either by his colleagues or the public, assertion number 4. Then we have moreover, and moreover, again, as we said before, is a word that tells us here comes another line of argument, or separate or independent reason for supporting the conclusion. So moreover, the conviction is evidence of flawed judgment, assertion number 5. Any straight-thinking, responsible drunk senator would have known to have called a cab. So we have 5 and 6. We could look at this and say, well, how do we know the senator has flawed judgment? The conviction is evidence of flawed judgment, right? The evidence is, well, if he didn't have flawed judgment, he would have known to call a cab. So 6 being evidence for 5. And then we go on, the next sentence, we also, and also tells us, here comes another reason. That is another line of argument, right? So we also cannot overlook the fact that we must now be served by a criminal who had sworn to uphold the Constitution. I take that all together as an assertion number 7, and there doesn't seem to be anything else that links to it by inference making, so it may be an assertion that stands on its own as a reason for supporting the ultimate conclusion. But then that's followed by the word finally, which indicates to us here comes the last of the several lines of argument. Okay, so finally, and then the word since, and remember, since tells us here comes a reason or evidence, right? So we have this last line of argument, and we begin with the presentation of evidence. Finally, since we have no evidence that he's not a chronically heavy drinker, we'll call that assertion 8, and, in other words, a separate piece of evidence, and no certainty that he will not again drive drunk, we'll call that assertion number 9. There's an implicit therefore here, doesn't say it exactly, but we know we're drawing this conclusion from the previously stated evidence, right? We have a clear responsibility to help protect the lives and property of the innocent citizens of Washington, D.C. So that last assertion we number 10. So let's look just at the final sentence. We have 3 assertions here, and it seems to be that this will be the final line of argument as well, indicated by the word finally. We have the 2 pieces of evidence, since we have no evidence that he's not a chronically heavy drinker, and no certainty that he will not again drive drunk. Notice that those 2 assertions are not related by inference. That is, one doesn't prove the other, but they're separate pieces of evidence which prove or support number 10, right? So we have A and B in both supporting independently C. So let's look at how this tracks out in the final diagram. So we go back to what we identified earlier with the should not return him. Voters should not return him. And indeed, that's the conclusion of the argument. So it goes at the bottom. It's the final point to which the rest of the argument leads. And we can look at the different lines of argument that get us to that conclusion, right? So we have, first of all, the major subclaim, the driving while intoxicated has compromised the senator's effectiveness. What's the evidence that he's had now compromised effectiveness? If he has had compromised effectiveness, obviously that's a reason the voters should not return him. But what's the evidence that he has compromised effectiveness? The first piece of evidence is that he has flawed judgment, and that's proven by the fact that he did not call a cab. So we could read this back and it would say, the senator didn't think to call a cab. That shows that he has flawed judgment. If he has flawed judgment, it shows that his effectiveness is compromised, and therefore the voters should not return him. But we also know that his credibility has been damaged, and when a person's credibility has been damaged, he will not be taken seriously. And if a senator is not taken seriously, then obviously also his effectiveness has been compromised. So there's separate reasons or separate proofs of that compromised effectiveness. So we could read the argument back and say his credibility has been damaged, therefore he will not be taken seriously. Therefore, this shows that his effectiveness will be compromised. Therefore, the voters should not return him for another term. Then we can go over to the left here and see that indeed assertion number 7, the fact that we might be embarrassed by the fact or humiliated by the fact that we are now being served by a criminal in the United States Senate, that seems to stand on its own, maybe a good enough reason by itself for voters not to return him. Then we go to the final line of argument on the far right here. We have those 2 pieces of evidence that come at the end. Notice they aren't linked directly themselves, 8 and 9, but they're separate pieces of evidence supporting the subclaim regarding our responsibility to the citizens of the District of Columbia. So we could say, we do not know if he's not we have no evidence that he's not a chronically heavy drinker, and we don't know that he won't drive drunk again. And together, these 2 pieces of evidence show that we have responsibilities to the citizens, protect the citizens, the safety of the people of Washington, D.C., and therefore the voters should not return the senator to office for another term. So again, you don't need to include the abbreviations of the assertions in your diagram. It's sufficient if you clearly mark the number of the assertions in the argument and just make the diagram using the numbers. But I've put them here to help clarify what each of the numbers represents in my marking up of the argument. So let's move on to number 3. It's a much longer argument, so I've divided it across 2 pages here, 16 assertions in all. But we'll do the same kind of exercise, reading through it and paying attention to, as we read it slowly, paying attention to those aspects of the argument which help us figure out the structure of the overall reasoning. Unquestionably, it is time for the university to crack down on student drinking. We'll call that assertion 1. Alcohol abuse among students is out of control and is having a negative impact on academics, on the public image of the university, and especially on the health of the student body. So if we were just to take 1 and 2 together, obviously it seems number 2 offers us the reasons why the university should crack down on student drinking. So 2 would be evidence for 1. But also notice in assertion number 2, that long sentence, there are actually 3 different ideas introduced here, which give us a clue, kind of a preview, if you will, of how the overall argument is going to be structured. We see that there's going to be an academic-related argument, that there's going to be an argument related to public relations or the public image of the university, and then there's going to be a line of argument related to the health of the student body. So if we pay close attention to that, this will help us look for the transition from one line of argument to the next. So we continue on, and the next sentence, which will number assertion 3, many professors will acknowledge that after a weekend of drinking, students seem unprepared for class on Monday. And then the next sentence, neither are students attending Friday classes regularly, opting instead for an early start to their weekend binge. We'll call that assertion 4. A few professors have even noticed that some students have been drinking before class or even taken quizzes while under the influence. We'll call that assertion 5. And this, in fact, is based on my own personal experience in this argumentation class many years ago. I had a student come to class, obviously smelling of beer, and he sat down to take the quiz while under the influence. So we have 3 pieces of evidence introduced here. The first one about students unprepared for class on Monday, students not attending class on Fridays, and some students even drinking before class. So these would all be academic-related reasons or academic-related proofs or evidence. And so we could mark that as one of the lines of argument with 3 different pieces of evidence: the Monday evidence, the Friday evidence, and the quiz under the influence evidence. So those separate assertions. And then notice it's also the case that, right? So it's also tells us here comes a separate line of argument. We just had the academic one. Are we likely now to get the public image argument here? And the case that would be an indicator, here comes some evidence, right? Because if something is, it's the case that, it tells us here's what we know, right? So it's also the case that the university, already an unpopular institution among the state's conservative voters, cannot endure the continued bad publicity associated with student drinking, assertion number 6. But notice how that follows the preview. We've had the academic argument, and now we get the argument, line of argument related to the public image of the university. So assertion number 6, then assertion number 7, headlines in the Union Leader like UNH student almost dies from drinking only exemplify the way negative publicity impacts the public's view of the institution. So we'll take that as assertion number 7. First of all, again, this is based on a real headline that appeared in the Union Leader one time many years ago after a student did indeed almost die from alcohol poisoning after a binge drinking. But notice the use of the word exemplify, which means to give an example, and an example functions as evidence. So when we see that, right, we say, okay, 7, assertion 7 is evidence of assertion 6. That is, the particular example of the headline from the Union Leader is an example of the bad publicity that the university cannot endure, as indicated in assertion number 6. So then moving on, ultimately, and we're continuing in this same line of argument here, ultimately, and ultimately is a word that tells us this is finishing up, the ultimate points, finishing up the subclaim or the line of argument, right? Ultimately, this, what's the this we're referring to? The bad publicity, right? Ultimately, this will lead to a decrease in support for the university from the legislature, from donors, and from the citizens of the state. So we'll call that assertion number 8. And we can see if we link 6 and 7 to 8, right? We have 7 is the particular evidence, the example that shows that the university suffers in its public image, which is assertion 6, and then ultimately tells us another thing follows from that, right? And that is the decrease in support for the university. So we would have the arrangement of those assertions as 7, 6, and 8 in the final diagram. Then we move on to the next sentence, and which begins with the word finally, which tells us, okay, here's the last of the 3 major lines of argument that we had introduced in the previous sentence, right? We had the line of argument related to academics, the one related to the public relations or public image of the university. So here comes the line of argument related to the health of the student body. So finally, students are endangering their health with their behavior, and we'll call that assertion 9. Then we get into the evidence in support of that subclaim that students are endangering their health. And the evidence begins with assertion number 10. Not only have 2 students died recently as a result of alcohol, not to mention the other who nearly died, as referred to in the Union Leader headline, so we'll call that assertion 10, related to the death of some students. It is also the case that, again, it's also, so another reason other than the death, right, another reason, and the case that, so here comes evidence, right? Short of death, alcohol abuse can lead to both long-term and short-term health problems, assertion number 11. So in the short term, so we have this division of the body of evidence into long-term related health effects and short-term related health effects. So we'll begin with the short-term ones, right? Which now maybe is another division of this last line of argument into 2 branches, long-term and short-term. So in the short term, students can suffer from a variety of nutritional deficiencies, depression, dehydration, anxiety, and even hypothermia. We'll call that assertion 12. And I'll take that all together as one assertion. Perhaps in your diagram, you've divided each of these medical conditions or health problems as a separate piece of evidence, and that's perfectly okay to do. Just makes your diagram a little bit more complex. You could, if you wanted to, identify them as 12A, nutritional deficiencies, 12B, depression, 12D, dehydration, etc., like that. And that is, of course, in addition to the hangover epidemic that strikes the campus on Sunday mornings. We'll call that assertion 13, but again related to short-term health problems. Then we switch to the long-term health problems. So the next sentence says the long-term effects can be severe, including liver failure, heart disease, and especially alcoholism. So we'll call that assertion 14. And again, you could divide each of those as separate pieces of evidence. For the sake of making the diagram a little bit more efficient, I've taken all of them together as long-term effects and called that assertion 14. And then we kind of wrap up the argument with the last 2 assertions here. No matter how the problem is examined, and we have examined it from an academic perspective, from a public relations perspective, and from a health perspective, right? So no matter how the problem is examined, students who drink too much are hurting themselves, their futures, and their university. We'll call that assertion 15. And then we end with the last sentence, a strict crackdown, including expulsion for violation of alcohol policy, should be put in place immediately. And again, you'll notice It's kind of saying the same thing that we began with, that we need a crackdown, but here we're getting very specific and we're introducing a policy claim with the should be. And the specific policy claim is expulsion for violation of an alcohol policy. So that tells us this is very likely the conclusion of the argument. So let's see how this plays out in a diagram. It's a little bit more complex, but the diagram itself, I think you'll see, makes perfect sense when you see all of these parts put together. So again, we start with where we ended, and we have that conclusion at the bottom of the diagram, assertion number 16, that students who violate the alcohol policy of the university should be expelled, right? Assertion number 16. And we've inserted here time for a crackdown, the way we opened the argument, as a kind of preliminary step toward that. If you left out that and just called it exposition, that would be fine with me. The main thing is we want to have that specific policy recommendation of expulsion functioning as the conclusion of the argument. But then we back up from that and say, well, why would we have expulsion? And we get that summary, which kind of goes along with the preview that we had, but the summary in assertion 15, because students who drink too much are hurting themselves, their futures, and the institution, the university, right? So what's the evidence of that, right? We know that we had that preview statement that tells us the evidence is going to come in 3 lines of argument. One's going to be related to academics, one's going to be related to public relations, and one's going to be related to the health of the student body. So we'll see that in the diagram. So if we go to the left side of the diagram here, you'll see that academic part of the academic line of argument, so to speak, right? That is, we can go back to assertion number 2, which talked about academics, public image, and student health. We've divided that into 2A, 2B, and 2C. If you just wanted to repeat it, or you even wanted to take that out and just use assertion 15 or 2 and 15, because they say essentially the same thing, right? But this is just the way that I've chosen to make those 3 lines of argument clear. So on the left now, we have the academic line of argument. That is, excessive drinking has a negative impact on academics. And what's the evidence for that? Students not showing up for class on Monday, which was assertion 3. Students skipping class on Friday, which was assertion 4. And students taking quizzes while under the influence, which was assertion 5. So if you read this back, it would say, well, students aren't going to class on Monday, they're skipping class on Friday, they're taking quizzes drunk. All of this is evidence that drinking has a negative impact on academics, which proves that students are hurting themselves, their futures in the university, which shows it's time for a crackdown, which means there should be expulsion for drinking violations, right? So that would be the academic argument. And then in the middle, we have the argument related to the public image or public relations problems that are created by excessive student drinking. We have the particular example, the evidence of the Manchester Union Leader headline, student almost dies from drinking. That's an example that shows the bad publicity that's associated with the university by student drinking, which ultimately, remember we saw that term ultimately, which helps us figure out the structure, which means ultimately there'll be a loss of support for the university, which shows that, right, their drinking causes a negative public image, which is proving that student drinking is hurting the university. So we could read that back and say, okay, we have the headline, which proves the bad publicity, which leads to the loss of support, which means drinking creates a negative public image that shows that the students are hurting the university by drinking too much, so it's time for a crackdown. Therefore, there must be an expulsion for violations of the drinking policy. Then finally, on the right of the diagram, we have all of that evidence related to student health. We have both the short-term and long-term health effects, right? This then shows that students are endangering their health, which is one of the previewed lines of argument related to the health of students. So we can go back and we could say, okay, we have all of those short-term effects like anxiety, dehydration, hypothermia. We identify those as 12A, B, C, D, and E. In addition, we have the hangover epidemic, which is assertion 13. All of these are short-term health effects. We have the longer-term health effects, 14A, B, and C, liver, heart disease, alcoholism. These are all long-term, right? So the long-term health effects, again, which prove that students are endangering the health. We should add in, which I've left off of the diagram by mistake, the additional fact that some students even die from alcohol, again, which proves that students endanger their health by excessive drinking, which was assertion number 9. That then partly proves the claim made in assertion 2 that by drinking students are hurting academics, public image, and their health, which shows that students are hurting themselves, their futures in the university. It's time for a crackdown. Therefore, there should be expulsion for drinking violations. So the key thing here in understanding how these diagrams work and what I'm looking for, the key thing is you want to be able to identify the correct conclusion of the argument. You want to be able to show clearly independent and separate lines of argument that lead to that conclusion. And then within any line of argument, you want to be sure you have the evidence and the subclaims in the right position. That is, showing how evidence supports a subclaim and then the subclaim leads to the conclusion, and having those inferences done in the correct order. So if you have any questions about this diagram or diagram 1 or 2 or diagramming in general, please post your questions to the discussion board.